Okay, welcome everybody. Well, tonight we are going to have the introduction to Revelation chapter 4. In our last few sessions, we were inspired to be overcomers with L, which is, we found out, the very definition of Israel. So now as we continue our journey in Revelation, we will see glimpses of what overcomers will experience. Yah has lifted the veil and revealed the door having been opened in Revelation chapter 4, verse 1. And that's a really big deal. We know in Genesis, this entrance was once closed and guarded. It became known as the partition of separation, a barrier between mankind and the tree of life. That's recorded in Genesis chapter 3, verse 24. Also, we read in Ephesians 2:14, for he is our peace, who has made both one, and having broken down the partition of the barrier. So tonight, we will also look at literary chiastic structures in his word. Now, I've reviewed some of this in our Shabbat group, but I find it very interesting and I wanted to share it with the Tuesday group. We will see Yah's fingerprint intimately involved in his living word. We will see his fingerprint intimately involved in us and in all creation. In the book of Revelation, we will be reading and hearing about what is taking place beyond time and space and how YHWH Yahusha will one day break through in glorious fashion to our three-dimensional reality. And that's going to be really amazing. I mean, I don't even know how, that's going to be phenomenal. So we will envision a glimpse of Yahweh's quantum dimension and his very throne room. We're going to take a look at and peer into his very throne room as described by John the Revelator. Now, in Revelation chapter 4, we will be introduced to the four living creatures, but are they just now appearing in his word, or have we seen them several times before? Who are they? What do they represent? Are they past souls of believers housed beneath their wings? Will we find them singing the song of the redeemed in Revelation 5? Have we seen similar patterns of the four living creatures on earth in the Bible? Have we read about them? In Revelation chapter 4, verse 7, it says, and in the midst of the throne and around the throne were four living creatures covered with eyes in front and in back. And the first living creature was like a lion, and the second living creature like a calf. And the third living creature had a face like a man, and the fourth living creature was like a flying eagle. And the four living creatures, each having 6 wings, were covered with eyes around and within. And they do not cease day or night, saying, set apart, set apart, set apart, Yahweh El Shaddai, who was and who is coming. So we think back when Yahusha said in Luke chapter 13, verse 34b, he said, how often I wished to gather your children together the way a hen gathers her chickens under her wings, but you would not. When he said that, was he thinking about his wings being connected to the four living creatures? Did he have that in mind as an extension of his wings? Also in Psalm 91 verse 4, it says he covers you with his feathers, and under his wings you take refuge. So there's several verses about his wings. So Yah has given us all that we need to know about being overcomers with El. And we've discussed to the degree we overcome will determine our positional proximity to Yahusha for eternity. We just completed his open book test in Revelation chapter 2 and 3 on what is pleasing and not pleasing to Yahusha, our groom. Only Smyrna and Philadelphia received no rebuke nor condemnation. Instead, they were commended. They were commended for their steadfastness. So we've looked at Ephesus, the loveless church, Smyrna, the persecuted church, Pergamos, the compromising church, Thyatira, the corrupt church of Jezebel, Sardis, the dead church, Philadelphia, the faithful church, and Laodicea, the lukewarm church. So next I want us to transfer our thoughts to literary structures of the Bible, because this structure affects the book of Revelation. So we're going to be learning about chiasms, concentrics, and parallelism. These literary structures refer to a structural rhetorical technique that is composed of several corresponding text pairs. So all I really want y'all to remember is that we're looking at literary structures of corresponding text pairs to keep it simple. We're looking at patterns. We will see that the book of Revelation was also written in a chiastic structure. This structure seems to show Yah's very fingerprint on his living word. So to me, it is just one more level of his added assurance of the authenticity of his word that can be found in the various books of the Bible, also within various chapters in his word, and even down to various Hebrew letters in his word. So is this important? Well, to me it is, because I want to know all I can about his word. So, and I do feel it's important because it's just going to help us understand how to interpret his word if we know how it's written. And this was a common way of writing back in John the Revelator's day. So let's kind of get a visual of what a chiastic structure is. We can find this in several places, but this is just one example in Genesis chapter 6, verse 10 through Genesis chapter 9 through 19. Chiastic structure is a nesting structure in which the first part of a text corresponds to the last part, and the second part corresponds to the second to last part, and so on. So for instance, using this example, Noah is mentioned in Genesis chapter 6, 10a, and then down here in Genesis chapter 9, verse 19, Noah is mentioned again. Or then Shem, Ham, and Japheth is mentioned in Genesis 6, verse 10b, and then down here it's mentioned in Genesis 9, verse 18b. Let me get my laser pointer right down here. So again, the verses are paired together. You have the ark to be built. You have the ark down here. You have flood announced. You have no flood in the future. You have covenant with Noah. You have covenant with all flesh. You have food in the ark. You have food outside the ark. You have command to enter the ark. You have command to leave the ark, and so forth and so on. And so this is a concentric chiastic structure only because it has a middle point that doesn't have a pair. So sometimes you'll hear of chiastic structures that are concentric, but they just call it chiastic just to keep it simple. So this chiastic structure started in Genesis chapter 6 here, and it went through Genesis chapter 9. So I don't have all the chapters in between, but that's what they did to determine this beautiful chiastic structure. And I think that's pretty awesome. By utilizing the concentric structure, the central text parts is emphasized as center of the relevant parts. So again, that's complicated language just to say that this center point is where the emphasis is given. And so the letter P represents God remembers Noah. So that is an example of a concentric chiastic structure. Okay, so let's take another example. And this is with the book of Revelation. We have a prologue in chapter 1, verse 1 through 20, and we have the epilogue in chapter 22, verse 6 through 21. And over here, I put chapter 22 and correlated several of the verses that are found in the prologue in chapter 1. So it's a mirroring and it's a pairing of these chapters that are speaking pretty close the same language in those chapters. So this is chapter 1 and this is chapter 22, just to show you that example. And so right here, that's one pair. Elohim gave him to show his servants what has to take place with speed. And in Revelation 22:6, these words are trustworthy and true. And Yahweh Elohim of the set apart prophets has sent his messenger to show his servants what has to take place with speed. So you see the similarities. Or blessed is he who reads and those who hear the words of this prophecy and guard what is written in it, for the time is near. And then in Revelation 22:7, see, I'm coming speedily. Blessed is he who guards the words of the prophecy of this book. And again, it says, for the time is near. And here in Revelation 22:10, because the time is near. Or here, favor to you and peace from him who is and who was and who is coming, and from the seven spirits that are before. And down here, the favor of our master, Yahusha HaMashiach, be with the set apart ones. Or here we have, I am the Aleph and the Tav, beginning and end, says Yahweh, who is and who was and who is to come, the Almighty. And again, it's stated here in Revelation 1, verse 11, and over here in Revelation 22:13. So we see the mirroring and the pairing of these verses. Now, then if we drop down to the 7 epistles that we just studied about the 7 assemblies, and how here you have the 7 angels. And so that's what they paired, or the 7 seals and the 7 bowls here, or the 144 saints and 7 trumpets paired with 144,000 saints and 7 angels spoken of in Revelation chapter 4 and 15, or the 2 witnesses spoken of in chapter 11 and the 2 beasts spoken of in chapter 13, the woman clothed with the sun in chapter 12, and the woman's seed keeps the commandments of Elohim. That's the remnant that's spoken of in chapter 12, verse 17. And the dragon is in heaven in chapter 12, 12 verse 4, and then he's cast down to the earth and the dragon persecutes the woman in chapter 12 verse 15. The woman flees to the wilderness in verse 6 of chapter 12 and flees again. She's given 2 wings as an eagle and flown to the wilderness in verse 14 of chapter 12. And then this is a concentric chiastic structure, because then the emphasis is that Satan, that dragon, is cast out. So the emphasis is placed on that Satan is being cast out. So by being aware of these literary structures, we should at times be able to find corresponding verses that may render additional insights. For instance, in one of our sessions, we pondered about the white stone that Yahusha would give overcomers with the new name written on it that no one knew except him who received it. And that was recorded in Revelation chapter 2, verse 17. Then in Revelation 21:12, the wall of the New Jerusalem is described as having 12 gates with 12 messengers and names written on them, which are those of the 12 tribes of Israel. And I remember in one of our sessions, we recalled we are living stones, and we see that chapter 2 is matched up with chapters 17 through 22. So we see again something that is comparable between the white stone and the name on that stone. And then we see that having 12 gates, and at the gates 12 messengers and names written on them, which are those of the 12 tribes of the children of Israel. Now, when I first read that verse in chapter 21, I was thinking that maybe it was just the 12 names of the patriarchs that cover the 12 tribes. But then after I read it more closely, it said, and names written on them, which are those of the 12 tribes of the children of Israel. So I don't know, is it just going to be 12 names, or is it going to be all the individual names? I don't know. But I just thought that was interesting. I believe someone had mentioned even that, it may have been in one of the sessions that we reviewed on the little video clips, that when someone was sometimes invited to these royal events, they would have a stone with their name written on it to be allowed to come into the gathering. So again, it's real interesting, what will that white stone represent? But I just wanted to bring that out. But mainly, I wanted us to see this concentric chiastic structure of how the book of Revelation is put together. And in the process of that, I believe I found another concentric chiastic structure on my own, and I'll let you decide that. But this is the sequence right here of the 7 assemblies that we've looked at time and time again. And what I noticed was, if I put them in a chiastic structure, that they pretty much do pair up rather nicely. We have the loveless and lukewarm paired up, and they have similar attributes. And look, Smyrna and Philadelphia pair up. And those were the 2 assemblies that didn't get rebuked, but they were commended for standing steadfast. And then we have Pergamos that is paired up with Sardis. These 2 assemblies compromised, and one compromised itself to the point of death. And then again, the middle one, Thyatira, was the corrupt Jezebel spirit in that gathering. And so there was an emphasis on that. And that assembly had the longest letter written to it. So anyway, I thought that was pretty cool. So that is a chiastic structure identified by Libby. So you can take that for truth or whatever, but I thought it was pretty cool. Okay, and then I was just exploring. I'm just exploring his word. And I thought about our 70th week, the last 7 years. And I just put that chiastic structure above it. And of course, it's really just speaking of, the covering of the whole book of Revelation, and it fits quite nicely. So I want us to listen to a little clip by Chuck Missler that even takes it further, because we've seen this pairing and this pattern of the chiastic structure, but look at this clip to really see the fingerprint of Yah.
Now allowed us to rediscover the very things that the rabbis knew thousands of years ago. And so it's a very fascinating study. But let me just give you one example to give you a flavor of this. This is Genesis chapter 1 in Hebrew. Now, I want to remind you that Hebrew goes from right to left. Also, the word Torah in Hebrew is spelled with 4 letters. A Tau, which is roughly equivalent to our T, an O, a Resh, a He, 4 letters. If you go to the first Tau in the book of Genesis, and that's the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet, it happens, and you count 49 letters, you come to a Vav. You count 49 more letters, and you come to a Resh, which is sort of like our R. And you count 49 more letters, you come to a He. So that is those 4 letters spelled Torah. Now, I need to remind you that all languages flow towards Jerusalem. Did you know that? All nations east of Jerusalem go from right to left. All nations west of Jerusalem go from left to right. All languages flow towards Jerusalem. I don't know what you're going to do with that piece of information, but I think it's interesting. Now, you can follow this without knowing Hebrew, probably, but you say, now why 49 was a square of 7? Okay, that's fine. That's not too surprising, but just a coincidence, of course. Or is it? Now, you could argue, well, that's just an accident of the frequency of letters and so forth. It's kind of rare, but interesting. Except what happens is when you go to the book of Exodus, you go to the first Tau, count 49 letters, you get a Vav. 49 letters, you get a Resh. 49 letters, and you get a He. Same thing happens. What's the probability of that? Whatever the first probability is, it's that squared. Okay? So it's very unlikely. Genesis, Exodus, you go to Leviticus, and it doesn't happen. And when it doesn't, you almost feel a sigh of relief. Huh? But when you go to Numbers, the same thing happens backwards. You take the first He, the first Resh, the first Vav, the first Tau, you get Torah spelled backwards. Now that's weird. If nothing else, I don't know how they found this out. They must have had time on their hands. They didn't have computers. This was. You go to Deuteronomy, you have essentially the same equivalent thing happens. And now you're puzzled because you've got it forward, forward, backward, backward. You can't resist going back to Leviticus and looking at Leviticus more closely. We have 49, that's 7 squared letter sequences. Torah, Torah, forward in Genesis, Exodus, backwards in Numbers and Deuteronomy. Well, if you look at Leviticus, you discover that every 7th letter spells the unpronounceable name of God. Often rendered Jehovah or Yahweh, expressed as Adonai among the Hebrews. They won't pronounce that name, they'll use the word Lord instead. Well, now we stand back from all of this. We have the name of God, and we suddenly realize that the Torah always points to the name of Jehovah. Now, what's the chance of that happening by accident? And by the way, if you've tried to contrive something like this and still maintain logic in the text, that's a challenge. This is a very non-trivial thing to design if you set out to design it that way. So many of us tend to regard these kinds of things in general as fingerprints of the Holy Spirit.
And this is another chiasm of the history of redemption. This was put together by Sandy Young, and she had a cross here where I overlaid it with the menorah, because the menorah is the true Christian symbol. And I thought it was kind of amazing also that the menorah is in a shape of concentric chiastic structure. And I'm going to go to the next slide just so you can read the entries more easily. So here again, his word is so amazing. His fingerprint is all over it. We have the chiasm of the history of redemption. God creates the heaven and earth, and then it pairs with God creates new heavens and earth. Man is created in the image of Elohim, and the first marriage takes place. Yahusha HaMashiach, the image of Elohim, is married to his bride, the church. The first Adam fails as the representative, resulting in condemnation. The last Adam returns and is vindicated before all. Unholy cities are being built, Enoch and later Babylon and Sodom. Babylon falls and the holy city will come down from heaven. So it's so beautifully composed that I had never studied much about chiastic structures, concentric structures, parallelisms. Maybe parallelisms were more familiar to me, and maybe some of you are very familiar with this, but if not, I wanted us all to be on the same page as we continue in the book of Revelation. And then in this particular chiastic structure, we see Yahusha HaMashiach is crucified. That's the main focus point. And also, praise Yah, we know he was resurrected from the dead on the third day. So we will also see many parallelisms between the prophetic writings and the book of Revelation. Now I'm talking about parallelisms, okay? So we will see that like in the Four Horsemen. This was just a little blog post of someone writing some insights that they had made. Like the Four Horsemen of Revelation 6, he said that's Zechariah 1 and 6. The mark of the beast, that's Ezekiel 9. The two witnesses, that's Zechariah chapter 4 and 5, which is within the context of Ezra 4, which indicate they will stand against the mixing of false religion as Joshua and Zerubbabel stood against the Samaritan mixing of Judaism and Assyrian paganism. Mystery Babylon, that's Genesis 11, where men tried to reach heaven with their own labor, works, salvation, which is very popular in churches these days. Ultimately, Bible prophecy is a pattern and is not a linear concept as Westerners think of it. It comes down to the philosophy of the Hebrew language, IMO, which this explains. This explains their concept of time, which sees us spiraling, which we'll get into that spiraling here shortly when we review the mathematics behind the Fibonacci sequence in the following video excerpt that we will soon view. So that is moving forward, yet repeating in cycles certain aspects of the ultimate fulfillment. So thus, while Nero and Rome weren't the fulfillment of Revelation, it was a picture along with the Bar Kokhba rebellion, the Spanish Inquisition, and the Holocaust. Nero was a picture of the Antichrist. And so was every tyrant in history, and so on. So yes, there's been many spirits of the Antichrist that have appeared throughout history. So let's take a look at this little clip.
Now, I want to show you something. We always talk about randomness. Gee, the universe came about by randomness. That's the whole premise of evolution, right? How many of you have ever seen randomness? Besides at Las Vegas, okay? As you look at randomness, and the intent here was to assemble random bits. And by the way, that turns out to be very difficult to do. In a computer, you can't get randomness. They have pseudo-random number generators that generate a string of numbers that meet as many tests as they can conceive of for randomness, but they're still not really random. But I want you to look at these treat these as random numbers. Do you notice what's missing? There's something missing here. Can you spot what's missing? Randomness lacks symmetry. Do you ever see random things symmetrical? See, the very concept of symmetry implies order. A center line on a drawing implies that there's an architect around. That's how they discovered all kinds of things about the architecture of the Temple Mount, because these things all line up on a center line. That has profound implications. You notice randomness lacks periodicity. Every third one doing something or whatever. There's no periodicity. In fact, that's one of the tests of randomness. If there's any periodicity, it fails the test of randomness. You know what I mean by periodicity? It has a cycle, okay? Randomness lacks any evidence of design by definition. Because if there's design, that implies it's no longer random. Randomness lacks order of any kind. That's why the scientists, as they search for extraterrestrial life, listen to the noise, the randomness, in the hopes of finding some kind of order. And what they rule out, of course, if it's periodic, every second or something, it could be generated by some natural phenomenon. So periodicity doesn't, they're not looking for that. But they're looking for any evidence of design. That's why random numbers are a typical conjecture. If you're trying to communicate to another alien culture, a series of random numbers is one of the ways to get their attention, presumably, because how would you generate that? Well, I got a surprise for you, because there is a sequence of numbers that, how many have heard of the Fibonacci numbers? There's how many? There's 1, 2, 3, anybody else? Okay, it's interesting. I have heard about these since I was a kid. I never took them seriously. And because they are the domain of some pretty strange characters. But back in the 12th century, Leonardo Fibonacci, he was messing around trying to predict rabbit populations. And he discovered a series of numbers that bears his name. And the first, it's 1, 1, then 2. Each number is the sum of the previous two. Third number is 2, the next number is 3, which is 1 plus 2, then 3 is 2 plus 3 is 5, 5 plus 3 is 8, 5 and 8 are 13, 8 and 13 are 21. See, each number is the sum of the previous two. You follow me? That is the Fibonacci sequence. The mathematician, he first discovered it in the 12th century, but he didn't recognize the real significance. It took several hundred years for people to discover that this sequence appears in nature in some of the strangest places. The ratio of any two adjacent numbers is approximately 1.6. It varies a little bit in the second and third decimal place, but it's very close to that. And now, it was several hundred years before the significance of the sequence is recognized. There is a sequence, it shows up in what's sometimes called the golden rectangle. The ancient Greeks seem to discover that there's a rectangle whose proportions are the most pleasing. And they call that the golden rectangle. That's when the longer side is the shorter side, as the shorter side is the sum of the two sides. And that's a rectangle of a certain proportion. It's on the screen right now. That rectangle is called by artists and scientists and mathematicians as the golden rectangle. And it has some peculiar characteristics. The ratio of the short side, the long side is 1.618 of the short side. But the point is, if you take a square out of that, you still end up with a golden rectangle. If you take a square out of that, you end up with a golden rectangle, and so forth. You follow me? It's got some interesting mathematical properties, and on it goes. Okay. It turns out the Parthenon in Greece, the Great Pyramid, the United Nations building, your credit cards, your playing cards, postcards, the switch on your light switch at home, writing pads, 3x5 cards, 5x8 cards, all of these are based on the golden rectangle, whether you realize it or not, okay? In art, Leonardo da Vinci, Van Gogh, Vermeer, John Singer Sargent, Monet, Whistler, Renoir, many artists recognized that by building their art on that golden rectangle, it gave it vitality and movement. And it was the dynamic, what they call dynamic symmetry, in contrast to static symmetry. So it implies growth, power, movement, and gives animation and so forth. And the artists have discovered that, and if you're a student of art, you're well acquainted with this. In floral arrangements, we discover the lily has 3 petals, the yellow-violet 5, delphinium 8, the mayweed 13, the aster 21, perithum has 34, helenium has 55, Michaelmas daisy has 89. So if you're one of these people, she loves me not, if you know the Fibonacci numbers, you got a chance of winning that one, okay? All these, of course, are in the Fibonacci sequence. There's a study among scientists called phyllotaxis, and that's where you study the arrangement of leaves around the stem of a plant. Visualize taking a plant and taking a cross-section and seeing how the leaves are ordered in the plant. It turns out the elm always has 1/2 the circumference, the beech or the hazel has 1/3, the apricot and the oak have 2 every 5, the poplar has 3/8. Each one of these, the almond, the pussy willow, pine trees, are always 5 to 21 or 13 to 34. These are all Fibonacci numbers. Now, first of all, they discovered this, and that was bizarre because you'll never find a number that's not in the Fibonacci sequence, which is weird. Out of 434 angiosperm and 44 gymnosperms, they all have Fibonacci numbers in their design. And scientists have discovered that maximizes the exposure to sunlight and air without shading or crowding from the other leaves. Depends on the nature of the leaves. So this is a result of very skillful design, but the design is motivated in part by beauty. And there's a whole other thing, I didn't get a chance to do this. You go down, if you're a diver, you know if you go down 60, 90 feet or so, it starts getting bluer and bluer, pretty dark. You go down deep enough where it's dark and turn on a light, things are incredibly colorful. Why? Nobody can see them. Why are they created in the first place? For his pleasure. We have a God that loves beauty. A whole other thing I get into here, as you drive and see scenery, you never see it monotonous, except unless you're going through Kansas. Yeah. As I was driving in here thinking about this talk, as you go drive a mountain road, we drive through a mountain road, and there's all these trees. The trees are random, and yet they're not monotonous. The design of the trees are not predictable. Each one's different, and yet conforms to a motif. It's astonishing how you can look through nature and never see monotony. It's always got the strange variety. So about seeds. The rows of bracts on pine cones, it's 8 or 13. There's 2 rows. On pineapples, there's 3 rows. It's 8, 13, and 21. And it turns out there's an optimum divergence angle of 137.5, which is, in effect, a fraction of the 360. That's a Fibonacci number. It produces the best packing. And that's why you always see Fibonacci spirals on sunflower. If you look at sunflower, you've got 2 divergent spirals. They're both Fibonacci numbers. And let's talk about music. How many play music in here? Okay, you've got 5 keys that are the pentatonic scale, right? You've got 8 that are called the diatonic scale. Those are Fibonacci numbers. You put them both together, you've got a chromatic scale, 8 and 5 together. A major sixth, which is considered, for strange reasons, beautiful, is a ratio of frequencies. That's 3 to 5. And a minor sixth is, again, a ratio of, these are all Fibonacci numbers, all through music. For some reason, it works. Certain chord, you hit 2 keys, some of them work, some don't. If you're a musician, you know why. But part of the reason is you got Fibonacci numbers undergirding that whole analysis. But here's the one that blew me away. I was reading up on this and I thought, that's kind of weird. If you look at the revolution of the planets in our solar system, you got Neptune. Pluto is a problem for a number of people. I won't get into that here. But you got Neptune, Uranus, Saturn, Jupiter, the asteroid belt, Mars, Earth, and Venus, and Mercury. If you adjust the observed orbits just slightly to what I'll call here the theoretical orbits, each one is a Fibonacci ratio to the previous one. And you say, Pluto is too, but in an inverse way, because it's 90,000 miles against Neptune's 60,000, so that's a 3-to-2 thing. But I want to stay out of that for some other reasons. Pluto is a whole other issue. Anyway, the point is, what's interesting, these are the same ratios that you find in the elm, the beech, the apricot, the pear, the almond, the elm, the pine, and 3 different pine numbers. You say, what on earth does the trees have to do with the design of the solar system? Very simple. The same guy did both of them. The same guy had an insight of what makes things beautiful. That beauty is an elusive concept on the one hand, and yet we discover there's certain rules even in design that we find. Let's just take one more. If we take the golden rectangle, take a square out of it, take another square out of it, take another square out of it, we have, with the golden rectangle, we can create a spiral, right? Very famous spiral, it turns out. It's the only spiral that does not alter its shape as it grows. It has that peculiar mathematical property. And you've all seen one in what's called the chambered nautilus shell. It shows up a lot of other places too, but I mentioned this is just a very crisp example. You find that in the hurricane, spiral seeds, the ram's horn, the tail of a seahorse, fern leaves, the DNA molecule. You'll find it in waves breaking on a beach, tornadoes, galaxies, the tail of a comet around the sun, whirlpools, seed patterns of sunflowers, daisies, and dandelions, the ears of all mammals, and especially the cochlea of the human ear. You have one in your ear that helps convert the sound vibrations into pulses that the ear can transmit to the brain. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. You remember Da Vinci's famous anatomical sketch of man. And you take from the navel to his feet, and you discover it's a golden rectangle relation. If you know that distance, you know how tall he is by applying the golden rectangle. And you can do that from his navel to his chin. You'll find the length of his face, from his chin to his lips, the tip to the nose to the pupils to the top of his head, and so forth. All these yield the distances of various parts. You'll discover the golden relationships are all through his basic design. And since man is in the image of God in some sense, it's not surprising to find out he apparently has what we understand to be mathematically harmonious proportions. And we find it all through nature, even whether you're talking about seeds in a plant or the orbits of the planets.
Okay, so we see that patterns are very important with Yah. I mean, they reveal a lot, and we will know the end from the beginning, and we are going to be mindful of these parallelisms, these chiastic structures, the beauty of nature all around us, the very fingerprint of Yah, even down not only to books in the Bible, but even down to Hebrew letters in the Bible. He wants us to know he is there with us. He wants us to know that there are things so miraculous that we haven't even contemplated how precise he is in all things. It's just amazing, just totally amazing. And here is just another example of the literary structure of parallelism. Parallelism is simply repetitive patterns, such as the AB pattern or ABC pattern. And an example of that is in Zechariah, where Zechariah 4, the 7 lamps and 7 eyes, parallel to Revelation 4, 7 lamps and 7 spirits, or Zechariah, the flying scroll, and Revelation 5, the sealed scroll, Zechariah chapter 6, 1 through 8, the 4 horses and chariots, and Revelation 6, 1 through 8, the 4 horses and horsemen. So we see how the New Testament is revealing all these things that we found in the Old Testament. We mentioned also about the request by prominent rabbis to ask Netanyahu to allow the Passover sacrifice on Temple Mount. I do not believe they got permission from what I can gather. They make that request They made that request last year as well. But we are just watching those things around us. And we made note that this is something that we are watching for, because we had looked and left the images here of when the animal sacrifices are reinstituted. That's going to be a major sign. And so we just continue to watch and wait. And like today, we're on the 198th day of the 220-day time period. That is essentially this gap between the 2,520 days and the start of the 2,300-day timeline. So I'm going to continue to count 22 more days to make it to the full 220 days, because there may take something may take place on the second designated Passover. That is biblical, that if someone would miss the first Passover, they could observe it in the second month on the 14th day. So we'll watch and wait. Or maybe they'll be looking at the red heifer sacrifice as a cleansing, but we're looking for animal sacrifice on a special altar. So, and then if those things don't take place, we scratch and this timeline for now, and we start over. So we're just watchmen on the wall. Now, I reviewed all of that for a reason, because I do want to review this article just to reinforce the authenticity of the book of Revelation, because I've gone through this study before in different ways and different formats, and it always seems to surface that some question the book of Revelation, or they question certain aspects of the book of Revelation. And I think we need to be able to trust his word. And I think one level of trusting his word is to see those fingerprints of Yah in his word, and contemplate if someone was to add and write a book or modify it in some way to a point, would these chiastic structures still be there? Would they be so mindful as to make it look? It's possible, but at the same time, I believe Yah has incorporated several aspects in his word to give us that assurance that he is Yah, and he is fully capable of making sure we have the word he wants us to be following. So this was an article written by Michael Kruger, president, and Samuel C. Patterson, professor of New Testament and Early Christianity. So it's titled "The Book of Revelation, How Difficult Was Its Journey into the Canon?" And it said, the story of the New Testament canon is a fascinating one with many twists and turns. There are books that were accepted very quickly, almost from the start, such as the four Gospels. And there are other books that struggled to find a home, such as 2 Peter. And then there is the book of Revelation. Few today would contest the claim that the book of Revelation stands as one of the most controversial, complicated, and esoteric books in the New Testament canon. Perhaps it should come as no surprise then that its reception by the early church was equally complicated and controversial. But the story of the book of Revelation is not what one might expect. Other debated books tended to have a lukewarm reception at the earliest stages, only to gain more and more acceptance over time. Revelation, on the other hand, had nearly the opposite experience. It had a very early and positive reception in many parts of the church, only to run into serious challenges at a later point. The author goes on to say, lately I have been doing a good bit of research on Revelation's canonical history in preparation for writing an academic piece on the subject. Here are a few highlights about Revelation's journey. Revelation's early reception was outstanding. Perhaps as many as any other New Testament book, we have evidence for an early, widespread, and consistent reception of Revelation. Our evidence goes back as early as Papias and also includes Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Muratorian, Fragment, Hippolytus, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, and Origen. That is an impressive list. He goes on to say, in addition, it is worth noting that almost every one of these church fathers accepted the book of Revelation on the same grounds, namely the belief that the Apostle John, the son of Zebedee, was the author. B.W. Bacon was so impressed with Revelation's initial reception that he was able to say, there is no book in the entire New Testament whose external attestation can compare with that of Revelation in nearness, clearness, definiteness, and positiveness of statement. And that was quoted from the Making of the New Testament. Objections to Revelation were later and limited. Our first evidence of any real objection to the book of Revelation comes from the person of Gaius in the early 3rd century, who rejects the book on the grounds that it was a forgery of the heretic Cerinthus. Curiously, this is really the only specific objection we're here about from someone who rejected the book. Most scholars agree that the so-called allegoi mentioned later by Epiphanius is not a real group. Dionysius of Alexandria is in the late 3rd century, makes the argument that Revelation was written by another John besides the apostle. Eusebius appears to agree with that, but it is worth noting that Dionysius does not reject the book on these grounds, despite the impression many give that he did, but still regards it as holy and inspired. Objections to Revelation were not driven by historical matters, is his third point. As we noted above, the main person, and to some extent the only person, who offered specific objections to Revelation in the early church was Gaius, who believed it was a forgery of Cerinthus. But what led him to this conclusion? It was not the historical merits of the book, but rather Gaius's objection to the chiasm, which means the belief in a literal millennial reign of Messiah Yahusha. Now, chiasm, isn't that ironic, is not to be confused with chiasm or chiastic structure. It just so happens that both of these terms are used tonight in this presentation. They have similar sounds, but they mean totally different things. Chiasm spoken here is the belief in a literal millennial reign of Yahusha. Some would argue if the millennium was not mentioned in the first 5 books of the Bible, then it is not justified. And these are people that are seriously researching and searching, just like we all are, for truth. And that is valued. But it is mentioned several times in the first 5 books. And how can I say that? And why do I say that? Because it's under the pattern of the 6 days of creation. And on the 7th day, he rested. This is the Sabbath pattern. We already know that a day to Yahweh is like 1,000 years. We have parallel micro views of the 7-day week, and we have macro views of the 7 millennial week. Every year we have a micro view of the Jubilee cycle as we perform the counting of the Omer, with the Omer count always beginning and ending on a Sunday. You count 7 weeks of sevens, or 49 days, and the 50th begins on the next weekly cycle, starting with Sunday, and that's your 50th. Likewise, the same thing happens with the Jubilee year count. It begins and ends on Sunday years. It's just the bigger picture. It's the macro picture. It's the nesting of patterns. And that is why I wanted to go over these things and have us be thinking about these things, because we're about to enter Revelation chapter 4, and patterns are paramount to understand the book of Revelation. So again, these are parallel time frames, like with the counting of the Omer and the Jubilee cycle. It's a microcosm and a macrocosm. And therefore, we are right now, we're ending the 6th millennium, which is going to lead to the 7th millennium with Yahusha ruling and reigning with him, and having the marriage supper of the Lamb with him, and entering into that Sabbath rest with him, as we await for the 8th millennium that will enter us into the day of new beginnings. So these are things we have to be mindful of if we're going to take a serious study of Revelation. And honestly, that's how all my studies are. And maybe some of you don't want to go that deep. I'm sorry, that's just Libby. She's going to take you where no man has ever taken you before. Who knows? But anyway, as we wrap up this article, it says Gaius opposed the Chiastic teachings in the church, particularly the Chiasm he attributed to Cerinthus. There is little doubt that the reference to a millennium in Revelation 20 led Gaius to erroneously presume that Revelation was a product of Cerinthus's pen. Objection to Revelation were eventually resolved. This was point number 4. Even though Gaius is pretty much alone in his specific objections to Revelation, apparently it did have a negative effect in some quarters of the church. Particularly in the East, there was a resurgence of doubt about the book in the 4th century and later. However, there were also many who supported the book. It was affirmed by all of those listed there. And the reason why these groups accepted the book was simple. It was an ancient book quoted by the early church fathers as authoritative. And for this reason, eventually, their view prevailed. In the end, the problematic canonical journey of Revelation reminds us that the development of the New Testament canon was not always a smooth and pristine affair. However, it also remains that in the case of Revelation, the problems had little to do with the historical merits of the book itself, rather with the particular theological peccadillos of some in the early church. And that just means theological finding faults, if you will, of some in the early church. When the actual history of the book is understood, its canonical status stands in little doubt. So I just wanted to review that brief article. It gives us some insight to the history and the names involved and those that had differences of opinions, and I wanted y'all to be mindful of that. So we are going to, right now, we are just focusing on the introduction of Revelation chapter 4 and preparing ourselves to enter in through that door, having been opened in Revelation chapter 4, verse 1. So as we already know, there are various opinions on how the book of Revelation will actually unfold. And I want us to be mindful that the best any of us can do is to be good Bereans and search the scriptures and let scriptures interpret scriptures. But even then, we will still have differences as we speculate about the end of days and future events. One major biblical belief that I need to emphasize that will greatly influence how we interpret the book of Revelation is our understanding about what happens when we die. Are our souls absent from the body and present with Yah? That will affect how we perceive and understand the book of Revelation. Or does the soul sleep in the dead body? Some believe the soul sleeps, but we are fixing to look into the quantum dimension of Yah's throne room. And we are going to see living creatures, and we're going to see elders, and we have to contemplate who they represent. Who are they? So I want us to understand how and why the way we view what happens to us when we die will affect our perception as we journey through the book of Revelation. And I want everyone to understand that it is not my goal to change anybody's understanding, but to only present how I understand these scriptures to date. Because it's only the Ruach HaKodesh that leads us to all truth. It's not Libby, it's not any other teacher or facilitator, it's the Ruach. So we are all in that sanctification process. It's not about being right or wrong. It's sharing our perceptions to date and our understandings to date based on scripture. And so since it's the Ruach that leads us to all truth, we can rest and enjoy our time together and see what his Ruach reveals. Now, I just want to share that it is my understanding to date that since the death, burial, and resurrection of Yahusha, the souls of the redeemed that were previously gathered in the comfort side of Sheol, or sometimes referred to as Abraham's bosom, are now in Yah's presence. And I'll share why I believe that and what I see as we get into chapter 4 and chapter 5. So as stated in Ephesians 4, Yahusha led captivity captive. And this is why John sees the door having been opened in Revelation 4:1. Now, absolutely no redeemed soul could enter into his presence until Yahusha made full atonement and opened the door, because Yahusha is the door. We will see these souls actively participating beyond boundaries of space and time. So, so those were a few aspects I wanted us to be aware of that will affect us as we study and perceive the book of Revelation. So, because we are going beyond time and space, and we are seeing these things as revealed by John the Revelator. So let's just listen to Revelation chapter 4 being read, and then I just have a few more things and I will close.
After this I looked, and behold, a door standing open in heaven. And the first voice, which I had heard speaking to me like a trumpet, said,
"Come up here, and I will show you what must take place after this."
At once I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne stood in heaven, with one seated on the throne. And he who sat there had the appearance of jasper and carnelian, and around the throne was a rainbow that had the appearance of an emerald. Around the throne were 24 thrones, and seated on the thrones were 24 elders, clothed in white garments, with golden crowns on their heads. From the throne came flashes of lightning, and rumblings and peals of thunder. And before the throne were burning 7 torches of fire, which are the 7 spirits of God. And before the throne there was as it were a sea of glass, like crystal. And around the throne, on each side of the throne, are 4 living creatures, full of eyes in front and behind. The first living creature like a lion, the second living creature like an ox, the third living creature with the face of a man, and the fourth living creature like an eagle in flight. And the 4 living creatures, each of them with 6 wings, are full of eyes all around and within. And day and night they never cease to say,
"Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come."
And whenever the living creatures give glory and honor and thanks to him who is seated on the throne, who lives forever and ever, the 24 elders fall down before him who is seated on the throne, and worship him who lives forever and ever. They cast their crowns before the throne, saying,
"Worthy are you, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power. For you created all things, and by your will they existed and were created."
Okay, so we are one with Yahusha. We are one body, the one new man, Israel. Yahusha is the head of the body. And Yahusha was reflected in the 4 gospel messages with the various characteristics of Yah or Yahusha himself. He was viewed as king in the Gospel of Matthew. And the Gospel of Matthew is reflected by the lion. And we automatically see that the lion, the calf, the man, and the eagle equates to characteristics of the 4 living creatures. And in the book of Mark, his character was the servant, and that's represented by the calf or the ox. In the book of Luke, the focus was on he came in the likeness of man. And again, one of the living creatures is a man. In the Gospel of John, the focus is as YHWH, Elohim, the eagle. And so we see that comparison. But also, in addition to the 4 covenant confirming gospel accounts represented by a lion, an ox, an eagle, and a man, Yahusha is glorified and exalted through the living gospel accounts that are sent throughout the world by his royal ambassadors. And so the gospel message is tied closely to the four living creatures by the animal descriptions. And we're going to discover about the four lead tribes of the wilderness encampments. They also were represented by the lead banner that would direct all the other tribes behind them when they broke camp. And those lead banners were a lion, an ox, an eagle, and a man. We're going to see these patterns. And they were a mixed multitude and consisting of many eyes, if you will. So I personally interpret the eyes of the living creatures to represent the redeemed souls of those that have gone on before us. They're giving thanks. We're going to see them praising. We're going to see them honoring Yahusha for their salvation through the blood of the Lamb, because they're going to be saying, you have redeemed us. And who is singing as we get into chapter 5? It's the four living creatures that are singing along with the 24 elders. You have redeemed us and made us a kingdom of priests out of every tongue, tribe, people, and nation. That is powerful. And I don't want to go through this too quickly. I want us to see these possibilities and to see these patterns. They each have 6 wings. And we know that there were 3 tribal encampments in each quadrant. So wouldn't it stand to reason that they would be symbolically represented by 6 wings? We shouldn't get thrown off by these living creatures, because we haven't gotten thrown off by the creatures that represent Babylon. Why should we get thrown off by the creatures that represent Yahusha and the souls of the redeemed? So they each have 6 wings, which represent a pair of wings for each of the 3 tribes per quadrant. And again, with the lead banner depicted by the lion, the ox, the man, and the eagle. So you would only see the lead banner, the head, and the other 2 tribes behind, you would only see their wings. The first tribe, you would see their head and the wings, but the other 2 would only be represented by the additional wings. And the Melchizedek kingdom of priests also consisting of many eyes from the 12 tribes and those grafted in of every tongue, tribe, people, and nation. These are those encamped the closest to the Holy of Holies and can enter the holy place before his throne. So you have the wilderness encampments on the outskirts, and then you have the inner circle of the priest encamped closest to the dwelling place. So these offer ascending offerings of prayers, praise, honor, glory, respect, thanksgiving. And when words fail, even the moaning of the Spirit within us glorifies him who sits on the throne. These are the bride. So as we understand that we are his kingdom of priests, as we're drawing closer to him, as we understand we are Israel, as we intercede for our brothers and sisters that have not had the veil fully lifted off their eyes, we see we are positionally moving closer to Yahusha. And that's going to determine our positional closeness to him for eternity. So we don't look behind, we press on, because we are Israel, the one new man. We know Israel means to overcome with L. All of Israel, the one new man, eventually are overcomers, but not all are the first fruit, such as the 2 witnesses or the bride that is just a subsection of the body of believers. It's like the rib that was taken out of Adam in Genesis. It's just it's just a portion and of the two olive trees of Israel and Judah. So we see, and we will compare the patterns. There's patterns everywhere. There's symbolism everywhere, but those symbols are defined in his word. So I want us to look at those symbols, and we'll look into Ezekiel, and we'll read about the living creatures there and in other places, and we'll do some comparisons. But you can see from a high perspective how, looking at the encampments in the wilderness, how all these people are represented by all these little dots, and how they would look like eyes. I mean, John the Revelator was trying to give us the best depiction as possible. And so here again, we see the pattern. This is more in a square pattern. And we see Reuben was the man, Judah was the lion, Dan was the eagle, and Ephraim was the ox. So these patterns are going to impact our understanding of the book of Revelation. So with that introduction, I'm going to close for tonight, and then we'll have comments and any Q&A.